For the Climate Discussion Nexus, I'm John Robson, here with the latest readout video from our Wednesday Wake Up newsletter, to which, as always, you should subscribe if you don't already, as you should support us with a few bucks a month, because we push back against nonsense like, well, this week the top item was melting Arctic ice again. Scientific American, between bouts of wokery like claiming that sex is not binary in mammals, tells us, quote, melting sea ice is opening new pathways through the Arctic such as the famed Northwest Passage, end quote. Which, of course, being climate, is terrible in every way, including, they say, quote, less ice means more fog, making it harder and more dangerous for ships to navigate the thawing sea, end quote. More dangerous than what? Navigating intact ice? You could ask Henry Hudson about that one. But the main point is that their claim that, quote, Arctic sea ice is rapidly vanishing as the world warms, opening up potential new shipping routes across the top of the world, end quote, is just plain wrong. The Northwest Passage was open in the early 20th century and again in the 1940s, though it certainly wasn't during the Little Ice Age when Hudson went looking for it and didn't come back. But since 2013, that ice has been rebounding, not rapidly vanishing, as so often confidently and wrongly predicted. And if you make a prediction and it doesn't come true, it's not decent to assert that it did. Even if you, quote, used historic data on Arctic fog conditions combined with model simulations to investigate how these conditions might affect shipping routes in the future, end quote, instead of, say, going and looking. In the newsletter, we also bring you a story with something to discuss just about everyone. An EV firm that the US president hyped and twisted corporate arms to fund is broke. Republicans horrified, free marketeers horrified, proponents of alternative energy horrified. But the president who applied improper pressure on General Motors to help Lordstown Motors borrow too much money for a product nobody wanted was Donald Trump. Democrats horrified, first because it's Trump, and second because he was pursuing their dreams of electric trucks and aggressive state industrial policy with little regard for formal rules. Republicans horrified because Trump acts like Swamp Thing, or at least they should be. Independents horrified at lack of meaningful difference between parties. Wall Street Journal also horrified. Its editorial board reminded readers of a supposedly settled principle, at least among the economically and politically literate, that, quote, politicians are lousy at picking business winners and losers, end quote. Oh, that again. Then the Journal quoted Mark Stewart, the North American CEO of Stellantis, whose slogan, quote, powered by our diversity, we lead the way the world moves, end quote, should have shareholders in full flight, as is the news that it makes Jeeps, Citroëns, Vauxhalls, and other things you might not want. Anyway, he said that it was buying out a bunch of workers because, quote, the competition is fierce and the cost of electrification cannot be passed on to the customer, end quote. As the Wall Street Journal sneered, quote, translation, workers will be collateral damage in the transition to EVs as they lose their jobs making gas-powered cars. Lordstown is a poster child of the new Washington consensus in favor of government industrial policy, and it won't be the last casualty of the hubris, end quote. See, the backstory here is that General Motors was phasing out gasoline car production in order to cash in on government subsidies for electric vehicles that people don't want, even back during the Trump years. So, after persuading GM's CEO to lend Lordstown $40 million, Trump used the firm as a 2020 campaign prop, as any typical politician would, including saying, quote, this is a great technology, end quote, and, quote, I heard the sales are great, end quote, although, the Journal noted acidly, quote, Lordstown hadn't yet sold a single vehicle, end quote. Not only that, but in January 2021, quote, its pickup prototype burned during testing, end quote, as EVs will. Moreover, quote, as it burned through cash, Lordstown sold its namesake plant and contracted assembly to Foxconn Technology Group. Last November, Foxconn agreed to invest $170 million in Lordstown, perhaps hoping that Inflation Reduction Act subsidies would provide a boost, yet Lordstown had manufactured only 31 vehicles by late February 2023, most of which had to be recalled, end quote. Now, as naive funders flee, it's warning of imminent bankruptcy. Stellantis, incidentally, is also getting Canadian battery subsidies, if only from 3 levels of government. So it's all hands on taxpayers' wallet, accompanied by politicians posing for glossy pics in front of this wonderful technology that you're paying for, whether you want it or not, and whether you could get it if you did want it or not. And now, a word from our sponsor, and that's you. Because at the Climate Discussion Nexus, we're dependent upon support from our viewers and our readers. Please go to our donate page, make a one-time pledge, or if you can, a monthly one. I'm not talking a lot of money, though. If you've got it, we'll take it. $2 a month, $3, $5. That's the sustaining funding that we need to produce these videos on our newsletter. And now, back to me. In the newsletter, we also bring the latest dispatch from Trade War III, European deployment of large tariffs in the form of, quote, the world's first carbon tax on imports, end quote. And from the, quote, does it also cause gout file, we bring you the view of, quote, Francis Donald, chief economist at Manulife Investment Management, end quote, that, quote, the new inflation is a different type of inflation that's going to be increasingly driven by global factors, supply-side factors, climate change, end quote. Mind you, if you add policy after climate change, we are inclined to agree. And then, from the satire can't keep up file, we note that after making that joke about whether it also causes gout, we Googled, and yes, someone is out there claiming that climate change exacerbates gout, as they would be. Oh, and last week we noted growing doubts about the feasibility of the green energy transition we were once told was so easy and profitable that it was amazing that it needed subsidies. Now, with a hat tip to Judith Curry, Andrew Nikiforuk in the T admits that, quote, we are going to have to dramatically downsize the dream of a future in which we replace 150-year-old fossil fuel infrastructure with clean energy by 2050, end quote. The idea being that we'll still do it, even though instead of making everyone richer, it will make you poorer, but what do you matter? In the newsletter, we also confirm that yes, they're coming for your stove, as Canary Media chortles, quote, New York passes first statewide ban on gas in new buildings, end quote. And they're coming for your lawnmower. USA Today says, quote, gas leaf blowers and lawnmowers are shockingly bad for the planet. Bans are beginning to spread, end quote. Finally, for all those climate alarmists who hate spring, as in, quote, there's no stopping the allergy apocalypse. Climate change is pumping the air with pollen, and it's a problem for people who don't think they're allergic, end quote. Well, Michigan had about 3 feet of snow in May, so children apparently still know what it is. We also draw people's attention to a Canary Media admission via an email headed, quote, carbon capture gets its day, end quote, that, quote, the world isn't cutting emissions fast enough to avoid disastrous climate impacts, end quote. And then it proceeds to describe carbon capture as moving too slowly, before adding, quote, campaigners are concerned focusing on these technologies will distract from the hard work of cutting emissions and throw a lifeline to the fossil fuel industry, end quote. To which we reply with our usual focus on practicality, and why not? If the idea here is to reduce greenhouse gases, you do it the most efficient way, right? Whether that's sucking it out of the atmosphere later or never blowing it in the first place. If our key metric is atmospheric CO2, not stratospheric sanctimony or eco-communism. But is your real concern out there not practicality but social engineering? Also, we got some advice from Euronews Green from rich white people for poor brown people elsewhere in keeping with our eco-colonialism video. It says India must not make our mistake and get affordable energy. Instead, they have to become all Zen or something. Quote, a new economy for happiness. Here's how experts think India can grow sustainably as its population passes 1.41 billion people, end quote. And when experts think, can journalistic fatuity and political make-believe be far behind? Strangely, the piece never actually says what the experts think India should do, but it does rant about, quote, the carbon budget that cannot burn without blowing Earth off a safe course, end quote, which has more when worlds collide than climate science to it. At some point, the piece even admits that, quote, India is now the world's third biggest emitter of greenhouse gases after China and the United States, end quote, and only plans to hit net zero by 2070, at which point we'll be hurtling past Venus trailing smoke or something. So people there seem to have little interest in lectures about, quote, another non-quantifiable element to the plan, which goes by the acronym LIFE, Lifestyle for Environment. It's described as a one-word movement enlisting citizens to live a lifestyle that is in tune with our planet and does not harm it, end quote. Unless you're John Kerry or Al Gore or something. But it's fine if you're among the roughly 1 in 8 Indian households without access to electricity. In the newsletter, we also return to the noxious mental weeds known as conspiracy theories to repeat that contrails are not mind control and the world's governments are not secretly changing the weather in some vast Davos-centered cabal. For one thing, if they were trying to, do you seriously think it would work? Is it your experience with the things that your own governments are allowed to be doing, like fixing potholes, controlling inflation, or protecting national security, that they possess even rudimentary competence? Still, we do have to mention, fair is fair, that the Mexican government is carrying out experiments to try to relieve its second worst drought in a decade, presumably therefore proof of positive climate heating, by seeding clouds in Tamaulipas and Baja California with silver iodide. The only hitch is, it's quackery. Nature says, quote, scientists warn that there is scant evidence that cloud seeding works, end quote. And while scientists say normally raises our hackles, we certainly prefer it to the Mexican government says, which it does, saying, quote, it has had successes, end quote. Yeah, mostly in handing out muchos pesos to people who do the pseudo-scientific equivalent of a rain dance. Oh, and speaking of Arctic ice, in the newsletter we recall pronouncements from the world's top scientists that the Arctic will be ice-free by the year 2000. No, wait, maybe 2004? Try 2008, or could be 2012, or 2013, but if not, then definitely 2015, 2016, or 2017, or 2044 for sure. Then we say, if you prefer facts to endless guesswork by various scientists selected by the media and loud activists, you should check Professor Ole Humlem's sea ice charts, again at climateforyou.com. And since you ask, here it is. With the global total at the top, Arctic sea ice in the middle, and Antarctic sea ice at the bottom. No, that's not land ice, that's sea ice. In each case from 1979 to the present. So yes, up to about 2013 there was a downward trend in the Arctic, but then it stopped. As for the bottom line, well, global warming is supposed to be melting the ice at both of the globe's poles, yet Antarctica stubbornly refuses to do as it's told. Then there's this vexed matter of scientific consensus. Because from Joanne Nova in Perth, Australia, we learned that only 3% of Australians believe that the Great Barrier Reef has attained record-high coral cover. But strangely, if you do your science not by getting a show of hands from humans, but a show of polyps from marine invertebrates within the class Anthozoa of the phylum Cnidaria, it turns out that the 3% who say the reef is at a record level are correct, and everybody else is wrong. And another thing, while a quarter of Australians thought that the reef was at record lows, fully 44% of Green voters said so. On this matter, the people supposedly following the science were the most ignorant. Bad on you, mates. And yet another thing on coral from the CO2science.org archive. A study of fairly long-term fluctuation of sea surface temperature in the Cook Islands in the South Pacific Ocean, based on the coral record, shows that it fluctuates in complex ways in 2 cycles with roughly 25-year and 80-year periods, possibly linked to solar activity, and certainly unrelated to CO2. For the Climate Discussion Nexus, I'm John Robson, putting another climate scare on ice.